Hi, and welcome to the Spin Room. This is the second annual graduate thesis TV show presented here live at SCI-Arc. This year we'll be having a CNN-style, around-the-clock coverage of the thesis weekend. This is our first segment, Coffee with Critics. So we're here having coffee with critics. Today we have Curtis Roth of Ohio State University, Sylvia Lavin from Princeton University, Thom Mayne, architect and faculty at SCI-Arc, and Andrew Zago, also architect and faculty at SCI-Arc. So we're here. It's Saturday morning. Was anybody here last night or yesterday afternoon? So what were some of the impressions from yesterday?
Just call me Wolf Blitzer. I've always wanted to have that name, so this is my chance.
You're now the Wolf Blitzer of architecture.
Great. I'll let the visitors comment. I'm too close.
Well, yeah, go ahead.
I wasn't here yesterday. No, literally, you just pulled me out of. We just started our jury, didn't we? And we didn't even get to talk yet. We just heard the presentation.
30 seconds of material that we've heard.
We're right in the middle of it all here. So Curtis, what were your impressions last night? Yesterday?
Well, I mean, I guess this is my first time at SCI-Arc for thesis, so I'm sort of processing the work a little bit. I'm struck by a couple things that I was thinking about this morning. One is the scale of the projects, which I think there's like a very large scale to all of the projects, which seems to be common. I don't know if that's a SCI-Arc thing, but it seems to be an interest here. So very few domestic projects, for example, which I think is, I don't know, something telling. I'm trying to look at the work and see things in common between the projects, and that was one thing for sure.
Okay, well, a lot of us have been here many times, and I've done a walkthrough this morning, and compared to last year, the year before that, and I'm going, where are we at this year? And there's obviously a continuity and a certain set of expectations that are there, and it starts with pure formal visual language and a consistency, let's say, that's for me goes all the way back to some of the ambitions of the school in 1972 as we were looking at the AA, and very particularly a publication they had that just showed an incredible kind of consistency of very complicated work, and at the same time maybe Cooper Union, which was part of that, and then for me, it's funny, starting today, I've had kind of a consistency of a certain critique that I have to revise. It's just kind of done at this point. It's redundant, and the conversation is going to be, I think, with any architect. Again, I'm a practicing architect that teaches, and I have no qualms about that. Is always going to be some degree of alignment between the ambitions and the terms of the project, and its relationship to the built world, let's say, or its engagement socially, culturally, environmentally, etc. And I think that's in some ways going to touch all the presentations, other than the pure conceptual, the conversation that has to do with the particular conceptual idea in place, which is autonomous to any connected world. That it has to do with that nature of the project, and but it's always kind of startling. I had this on my calendar 6 months ago because it's just it pleases my eyes. It's just a pleasure to walk through here and just look at the kind of insane kind of energy of this place, and it's you're expecting it, right? I've done it so many times, I know exactly what to expect, and it's not going to disappoint me at that level. It'd be the next conversation that gets more serious, that has to do with just the nature of its relationship to the profession, etc.
I misunderstood your first comment in my Saturday morning fog, and thought you just meant that the things on view were very big.
Oh.
And not that they were dealing with large-scale urban projects.
Yeah.
And I would say that I think my misunderstanding of your comment is produced. I mean, it's not an accident. I think that there is something about scale, the bigness of the images as a stand-in for dealing with big problems, let's say. I don't know whether I think it's a very aspirational position, making big pictures of big things to try to indicate your concern for big issues that affect large numbers of people. I think that's the way that I read it. I think that there have been some other schools that have tended to have big production, and I would have read those slightly differently. Like, let's say there's a certain profligacy of materials at some places, like kids that don't pay for plots and don't pay for this, and they get bigger and bigger and bigger. There's a kind of competitive bravura that's about bigness in that way. Whether or not we can steer the conversation from aspirational fantasies about affecting large-scale problems to ways of actually engaging them, which I think is what Thom is talking about. That's always the tension of a school like SCI-Arc, that it, on some level, its interest lies in the things that it is able to do inside its walls, and its limitations are the strength of the things that it does on the inside of its walls, because they're very intoxicating in some way, and it's hard to escape their gravitational pull.
Well, and off camera,
Yeah.
you happen to be looking at two of the largest prints, a couple of the largest prints I've ever seen at SCI-Arc, shy of a billboard. So this is perhaps setting a new record, some of the scale of production. Although I guess that's always,
It's big
there's
here.
always
There's
been
always big.
big. I remember talking to someone when I wasn't here at SCI-Arc for a number of years, and the school was in transition. I was asking someone what happened at Thesis, and they said, well, it's not clear anything is good there, but still, it's the only school in the world where there will be a 30-foot-long context model. And I thought, oh, that's
No, it's big.
right.
Yeah.
We're looking at one right behind Andrew here that's, looks like 8 4x8, maybe 4x10 panels put together very nicely, seamlessly put together. Is there a bit of a culture shock, Sylvia, coming back from the East Coast and getting maybe a different frame of reference now?
Gosh, am I coming back from the East Coast? That's weird to me. No, I mean, I think that having lived here for a very long time and having worked closely with a lot of the faculty here for a very long time, there's nothing shocking about coming here. I find what I expect to find. I find it increases in refinement. So I don't think it's the same every year, but I think it definitely it increases in refinement. It would be hard for me to say that I could argue that the kinds of questions that are posed have changed radically in the last 5 to 10 years. And I think that would be an interesting question to ask faculty about, whether, whether, let's say you wouldn't, Thom mentioned the AA or Cooper and so forth. So under Hayduk or under Boyarsky or whatever, the schools had a project, and the project unfolded for quite a significant number of years. It needed time to discover what it wanted to do, and I think its effects on the world are probably still only unfolding now. So I think it's very difficult to assess change and rates of change and so forth. I do think that right this minute, the world has changed a lot in the last couple of years, and whether or not it's important to encourage a place like SCI-Arc, of all places, to engage with the Trumpification of the United States, for example, that's an interesting question. I don't know how to do it,
Yeah,
but
I think your question is 2 or 3 decades old. That shocking is this school would have been, the notion of shocking would have been maybe 80s or something when I represented that, and I would have said this is actually status quo, but the issues aren't shocking anymore. One expects here a kind of extreme kind of expansion of the imagination in visual terms, and it's, I would have said, normative behavior for this place for decades. And the questions would be much more specific to the nature of that investigation and kind of where it is today. But I would, if you're shocked coming in here, you're kind of outside of the world of what's gone on in architecture for quite a few decades, because this is if anything represents just a continued maybe more sophisticated, or that'd be the next kind of critique of what's been going on here for decades. And again, that shock value was interesting, 70s and 80s, but I would have said this is now represents a kind of a clearly defined continuity within the realm of pedagogy and architecture. And it would be East Coast, West Coast. It'd be global to start with. So if you had to connect this place, it'd be the Angevin and it'd be the Bartlett. And you could rattle off the schools that are going to today that they had at the Stadels here, and he's going to feel completely at home here, just from the Stadel. And you would actually connect certain institutions which allow a certain kind of freedom. Because I would have said here, what you're looking at is, in its best form, is it a method of thinking, and they think visually. And they think through material substances. And some of it is not even discursive. And if it is, this one we'll pick that up. And some of it is precisely because it's not even describable yet, not shocking, just interesting or compelling, right?
Yeah, I guess
it's what it is.
Shocking in terms of like visually shocking, but kind of culturally different than what's going on in the East Coast. How are these issues of maybe a new kind of engagement?
So I have to say, the East Coast, West Coast thing is really such a 60s formulation. We're all on planes 24/7. So I think that's maybe not productive. Maybe we could just talk about what shifts do we see happening in the field, and do we see them registered here? So I'll just throw one thing out, and then Zago, the
I have a
chair is
question
yours.
for you.
Okay. Well, I just want to say that I think that the era dominated by questions of metaphor and images as representation, I would say that era is closing. The efficacy, that work has had its effect. And image culture is now shifting, and it's moving away from an attachment to metaphor and more to the implication of what has been called imaging craftsmanship. And that would be a change that could find a home here because they're very good at images. I would say the craftsmanship issue of imaging is still is not in the foreground. I think it's still metaphorical, representational, and imagistic in that way. And I think that that'll be the thing that they resolve over the next few years. I don't think it's an East Coast, West Coast thing. I think people are working on how to go from metaphorical projections to a kind of more materially, technically specific understanding of the impact on the world of things that hit the retina.
My question, I'm sorry, my question is a little bit of a non sequitur, but it goes back to your comment about important moments at schools of architecture and how it takes a number of years for this to unpack and it still unfolds. And you mentioned, I think, Boyarsky at the AA and maybe Schumi at, but one of the really important ones was Lavin at UCLA. And I'm just wondering, like, if you look at, and I know you haven't had a chance to look around here, but you know the school well, do you think that there is any unpacking of the accomplishments of that time here? Or is it like an unrelated project? It's not a leading question. Once you said it, I just got very curious about where some of the strands that one sees at SCI-Arc that are not homegrown, where they might have come from, and maybe in our vicinity, even though you're right about the East and West Coast, that would have been the biggest sort of seismic event in the past years.
I don't know what to say, except I'm probably not the person who could answer that question so easily. But I would say that there is an institutional ecology that develops in places because it's easy for people to go back and forth and so forth. Right. So there are people who teach here who went to school there and vice versa, right, and so forth. So, and I think that I mean, maybe Tom will know this better, but my sense of LA, my sense of the history of LA back in the 50s when there was SC
Right.
and kind of nothing else, right? It was very, the sense that you could be a heroic loner was matched by institutional solitude, if you will. And now every institution has to negotiate its position with other people and other capacities. And we have a sort of art school model in SCI-Arc. We have a research university model. And SC, which has at least historically been the more professional model. And it would be interesting to think about how those work together. So I don't know whether in Tom's day, in the early days of SCI-Arc, they talked about research, but I hear the word here, that's research is a sort of university term, if you will, for better or for worse. I don't know whether that term always contributes in the most positive way to.
But it's a very, very different moment right now. And I think in the 70s and 80s, because I studied, there was an incredible connection at SC with the case study, of course, under John Atenza. And my teachers were Pierre Kotick and Craig Elwood and Seriano and Gregory Ain. But they were in their later part of their careers, and didn't quite capture our interest. I never even kind of grasped the importance of those people until I was in my 40s, looking back, because at the time I was very disinterested, and we were all heading over to UCLA. And Pete Cook and Heron and the Archogram boys showed up, and they were just captivating us. And it's where we took our name, the collective idea, and blah, blah, blah. And a whole group of us were hugely influenced by the Archogram era. And, but it was, and then in LA, it was a particular time of a new congealing that was post case study. And it was looking for some new thing. And of course, what was taking place in that era within film, across the arts, and particularly in LA and the art scene, was instrumental to that. And then what took place is, I always forget myself that UCLA didn't start until '68, and SCI-Arc was only 4 years later. The two could be seen and historically as kind of singular, right? And then SCI-Arc shows up right afterwards. It is this kind of a miracle thing that it even kind of happens. But then very quickly there became a bond of characters and a community, very particularly between UCLA and SCI-Arc. And it became, in some ways, parallel opposite to the case study. There was a set of relationships, and unlike the case study, there seemed to be a group of us that could agree to disagree. And so there wasn't the kind of singularity that drove the late modern gang here. And it became kind of a very different kind of collection that still, we're all old men now, that still are connected to these schools as the next generation shows up. But it's funny, I would have said, based on the earlier argument, I sense that we're at a place in between right now. I can't answer what the next step is. And this place has a unique opportunity because of the openness of allowing people to think in ways that are maybe seen as illogical, that don't follow preconceived kind of notions. Because I would have said that we've played out now definitely what was taking place in the 80s and early 90s, and then the digital thing kind of kept us going until maybe half a decade ago or something, and we're now looking again. And there doesn't seem to be any kind of singular, there's no zeitgeist, there's no singular kind of idea of what architecture is or the effect of anything. That seems to be extremely dispersed right now. And your beginning comment is scale. My sniffer would say, it seems like urban projects, infrastructural projects are somewhat compelling, and maybe one can instinct that that's going to be the future of architecture in terms of the major kind of project. And my guess is some of this would be that they're in that same kind of sense, maybe not kind of really consolidated yet into a clear idea, but there's just a kind of sniffer that it seems like that's where the kind of issues are today, and that's actually what's taking place in the practice. But now the work is getting, due to just outrageous scales that are now what used to be in the 60s, considered mega projects are now normative projects in a huge amount of the world that require a very different kind of thinking and a much more complex kind of thinking. And then my sense is that what you're sensing is the students are already, right? But maybe it's just at a sniffer level. It's not quite kind of articulated yet.
I think along those lines as well, the kind of question of local and global is like a huge question today that can kind of frame everything from nationalism and this idea of like anti-globalization as a political ideology.
We had a board meeting yesterday, and they go over. We looked at the 500 plus minus students. It's A to Z. This place is absolutely a global place, and you go to class, and it's this interconnection going back to East-West. That's again so far old. It's East-West. It'd be East-West. It'd be China. And we're talking at a different level of East-West.
But I think there's still this kind of like maybe within culture today a little bit of pushback against that globalization, and I'm wondering if anybody sees that starting to, and not only in politics but also just in culture. But like, is there like a local music culture? Is that even a thing anymore? Are there local cultures of anything anymore? Does SCI-Arc have a specific locality, or is it totally just enmeshed in globalism? And
is that a Zago? That's a your. I don't know.
No, I mean I'm just saying that I think that's a huge question today. Like the feedback between, or the kind of battle between local and global, something like Hudson Yards versus a kind of architecture that isn't rooted in the kind of mega project of global cities. I think maybe it hasn't hit architecture yet, but I'm just wondering if
is an example of anti-global or is global?
I think it's purely global.
Okay.
And I'm wondering if there's kind of a cultural pushback towards that in.
Because I think there are people
this
who would
place.
argue the reverse, which is just to say that I think the terms are very tricky. I mean, I don't know. Listen, I'm just sitting here looking behind you at a bedazzled house. So I mean, I don't. I'm very happy to talk about SCI-Arc becoming interested in global infrastructure and large-scale politics. But actually, what it does is bedazzled houses, and it's a place that makes room for bedazzled houses, and it has to live with that. It has to live with whatever the potential of the bedazzled house is, and it has to live with the limitations of a bedazzled house. I mean, I think it's both. I think it's both very, very powerfully. And Thom is now here. We'll see what he does to the bedazzled house. Thom believes in the real world, that the space of autonomy is.
I don't believe in it. I live in it. I'm neutral. I just exist.
No, Thom.
No,
Thom, that's not fair.
This is the form for a critique. So I'm
Yeah.
not doing that. That's not
No.
because I have my own very strong ideas of the nature of this work, and that's why I'm here. That we, again, the notion of a series of people that can agree and disagree and have conversations. That's what today's about, right? Of having those conversations, and the diversity of the school has always been its strength, right? And it seems to be more so under Hernan, that there's a group of people here that that agree to disagree, to have different opinions, especially in a time when we're searching. When we're deciding what are the various roles of architecture in society today at very basic first principle levels. What is our role within, and a profession that's not the strongest profession in the world, right? And that has, in terms of having a voice, right, at the table. And I can only be concerned with that because I sit at the table and I demand a voice, right? And but again, this is a place that's asking very kind of basic kind of questions. And some of it, it's funny to me, the international, I'm not sure it's so literal. I watch my students, and again, it's just not at this place, but just in education in general in this country. And this lovely kind of things take place culturally between things that are kind of unplanned and just they're happenstantial. That's extremely useful. That in fact it just represents the reality of living within a global culture. So they're classmates now, right? And things happen that you can't anticipate, which is it's Marco Polo meeting Kubla Khan, but at times at the scale of something, and it makes for also an extremely interesting environment at this particular time when we're searching, and that search is going to be culturally global, and this is the cultural conversation, but right, it's going to be very complicated. And you were mentioning, I'm looking at this thing. I'm not quite sure where it's located in terms of what culture, because other than it's subjective, the nature of what aesthetics is, right? That it's vastly cultural and subjective. But you're going to see it as you walk around the room, I think. You're going to see that same multicultural kind of influence, right?
No, I was going to say, I mean, there's also a kind of simple answer to a simple observation, which is this is an extremely international student body. And I think that's probably not that unusual, certainly at sort of advanced graduate schools, but that's definitely a characteristic of SCI-Arc. You're here, and I get students that leave here, they barely, we are here and we think of our relationship to LA and to downtown LA as being very important. There's a lot of students that come through here, they do great, and they barely know the city. That's not the network that this is in the middle of. And that's,
It's been striking for me coming here. Sorry.
And they see, that did come up, LA.
yeah.
No, you can't understate that this place is in Los Angeles, and it's the fit between the broad notion of Los Angeles as a place and this institution is absolutely this, right?
And this institution has such a strong kind of character, and it's been interesting for me coming here, seeing some of these questions of metaphor and some of these questions of imageability play out differently here than maybe at other schools, but they're the same questions being asked. And I think that's what is super interesting about SCI-Arc, is how it's absorbed some of these questions and just made them their own in a way. But it's definitely still distinct. And so that idea of like a kind of, I don't know if you agree too, coming from the Midwest where they're asking a lot of those questions as well, from those kind of, from like Ohio State,
Yeah.
and where that kind of stuff's been kind of developed in a way in the last decade or so.
Well, I mean, maybe a little bit going back to the question of image crafting, and this is a slight diversion. I think one of the things that's really striking, I guess, in looking at this image behind us or the images around the room, is that I think oftentimes you'll see in a thesis review the idea that the project exists between many images, right? So there's a collection of 10 or 15 different images of a project, and somewhere the project exists behind those images. Here, I think there's a kind of different rhetoric about how we're being asked to look at an image. Like there's the image and then there's the model. Almost in every case, there's a single image and a single model. And so that the idea that the image, that we sort of look at it like we look at a model, I think is something at play maybe in this room that I don't quite know what to make of, but maybe that's, if I were to say that there's a different sort of rhetoric of the image, it's the idea that this image is very much understood like we might understand the model in the foreground, which seems to be a different way of considering images. Yes.
A tendency that has its critics within the school, by the way.
Well, I mean, it wasn't a value statement, but it was really an observation that I think it's a completely different rhetoric from what we would see in the Midwest, as an example.
And the projects are so diverse, they push you to go beyond your own range of. I enjoy that. I walk around the room and there's projects that I'm going, I have no bloody idea what's happening here, so let's listen, because it's going beyond my bounds of understanding within a conceptual territory or something.
Yeah, sure.
I'm curious that you say that the projects are diverse. I would say that they're varied, but actually there's a very strong coherence. I mean, but that's why I assume that's why you mention the AA or HADEC, because while the few people with very great expertise could, spend a week talking about the difference between Danny Liebeskin's thesis and somebody else's thesis.
Can I say diverse with a very powerful singularity?
Yeah, I also have to say, just maybe this is a difference between university culture and other kinds of culture, but the word diverse makes me a little bit nervous, right? Because in a university culture in the United States, it means something very specific now. It means first generation people, it means people of color, it means certain kinds of people that have been excluded from the forms of advancement that particularly public universities are meant to support. So SCI-Arc is not a public institution, it is not a research institution, and the fact that there's, quote, diversity because it's international is not actually addressing the problems of diversity that we mean, that word must be reserved to refer to when you're speaking about the United States. And sorry, I mean, and I think that part of
next year, I'm working on it.
Okay, but I'm just saying, if you want to know what's happening at SCI-Arc, what's happening is that people come in and have to make a certain kind of insistence on the clarity of the use of words, that they mean something. And if just to cut to the chase, virtually every model in this room is made out of a highly toxic piece of plastic, right? Virtually every single one, right? So in some other place, there would be a discussion about the carbon footprint of the production. There just would be. Now, is that East Coast, West Coast? Am I moralizing? But if you want to cut to the chase and say what's happening in the world, those are things that we know people here care about, how to integrate them into the kinds of issues that they're committed to. That is a very profound challenge. And I would never expect them to come up with it overnight. That would be a stupid and easy. Please, whoever, the 3 people in the world who are watching this, do not go out now and make wood models. I mean, that's just an easy, cheap, stupid response to what is a very problematic set of issues. You know, you were just, I don't know. I mean, you know, we've got, if you go to a college campus, you've got 18-year-old kids who are worried about Trump starting a war and getting called into the draft. You know, that is not an international problem yet. You know, that's an American citizen problem, and you know.
Well, although there's
Can I, for the record, say I totally agree with you. And I'm being very overly polite, and I was discussing within a completely different, narrow kind of framework that diversity is. I'm 100% agreeing with you, of course, in terms of the broader kind of conversation. It opens up a very, very different.
Yeah, I mean, these are amazing topics that could frame almost everything that we do in a way. So it's great that we've started off with this stuff at the first half hour of the spin room today, and it's a really good way to get things going. I want to thank everyone for taking a break from reviews to chat with us today and have a coffee. So thanks for coming. We'll be back in about 20 minutes. So thanks for joining us in the spin room where it's all spin all the time.